Good afternoon in Johannesburg, Alison and Phillips. Here morning in Alabama. So I'm very delighted today. We have our second episode of our video lecture, Planning Megacities in the Global South. The first episode we have with city of Wuhan. Now in the second episode, we have Johannesburg, South Africa. So now we are here have the authors of that chapter in the book. The purpose again of this video is become a supplement of chapters in the book, or maybe also provide some updates if there is some updates happen since the publication of the book. So now I am here delighted to have both authors, Philip Harrison and Alison Todes. So now I invite them to introduce themselves, and after that I like them to make presentations, and at the end of presentation we will have a Q&A session. So now it's time for you, Phillips and Alison.
So thank you very much. We're delighted to have had the opportunity to contribute a chapter to the book. And we think it's a book that will make a great impact. And we're also very pleased to be able to contribute to these lecture series. So thank you so much. I'm Philip Harrison. I'm a professor of spatial analysis and city planning at Wits University in the School of Architecture and Planning.
And I'm Alison Todes. I'm a professor of urban and regional planning, also in the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of the Witwatersrand.
All right, so now you can start your presentation if you're ready.
Okay.
Thank you. We're going to share the screen with you, and,
yes.
and then I will start, and then I'll hand over to Alison.
Very good.
So we will follow in the presentation. We will follow this broad outline. Essentially, we'll start with a description of Johannesburg, of its context, and of the evolution of strategic spatial planning in Johannesburg. And then we'll move into a discussion which Alison will lead on the challenges, the contradictions, and the prospects of strategic spatial planning in the city. So in May 2019, Time magazine, in fact, illustrated one of its covers of the magazine with a photograph that was taken of Johannesburg, of a densely packed informal settlement right adjacent a middle-class residential precinct. It's a photograph taken by Johnny Miller, and it's really graphic. It's illustrative of some of the stark divides in the city. Of course, not all the divides are as dramatic as this photograph illustrates. But Johannesburg is certainly a city of division and inequality. UN Habitat ranked Johannesburg as the most unequal large city in the world. It's a city which has an unemployment rate of around 30%, probably now with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's higher than 30%. Its Gini coefficient is around 0.7. That's income inequality. If we look at asset inequality, which allows for the reproduction of inequality down the generations, it's 0.9. So it's an extremely unequal city. And for that reason, the term transformation is resonant in our local politics, in our national politics. And indeed, because of the history of apartheid, transformation is often associated in the South African context with race-based economic exclusion. So that is the critical point of context which we are responding to in our chapter. And inequality and social divide in South Africa and Johannesburg is deep, it's structural. It can't simply be addressed through spatial rearrangements. So the drivers of inequality include, for example, dysfunctionalities and inequalities in the labor market, a still really unequal system of education, inequality in terms of asset ownership, which will take perhaps generations to resolve, in terms of public health. The spatial dimension is there. It does matter in Johannesburg where people live. It does matter that the poor mainly live on the spatial periphery, and that there are high costs associated with movement every day for the poor between residence and work. And so addressing spatial inequality is important. It's simply that by addressing spatial inequality, we can't expect to address all the deep structural divides in the city. And so we do need a serious conversation on both the limitations and the prospects for tackling inequality through spatial planning. And that's what we try to do really in our paper. So it is a critical task, notwithstanding the limitations. And Johannesburg, of course, is a case in extremis. It is one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal city in the world, but it still speaks to international literatures. It speaks to international literatures about the role of planning and the possibilities for planning in the context of great divides. It speaks to North American literatures on the spatial mismatch between jobs and residence. But it also speaks to the sort of literatures that are presented in the Routledge Handbook, literatures on addressing spatial inequality in contexts where state capability may be relatively weak, in contexts, for example, where informality is a significant presence on the urban landscape. So a case in extremis, but also a case that is important for other literatures. So very briefly, in terms of the context, Johannesburg is the largest city within a wider urban agglomeration. If you look at that map, you'll see two boundaries. So the outer boundary is the boundary of Gauteng province, which accounts for about 37–38% of South Africa's economic output and has about a quarter of the population. So that province, in a sense, is a sort of city-state, has a population of 14–15 million. The inner boundary is the metropolitan city of Johannesburg. The green and the red represents the spatial footprint. So the core of the city region really is the city of Johannesburg, with a population of about 5 million, grew very rapidly with the ending of apartheid as restrictions on migration, on race-based migration were removed. But it's not the only metropolitan city in that agglomeration. To the north is the capital, Pretoria, Tshwane, a metropolitan municipality, and then Ekurhuleni to the east. So that's the wider agglomeration. So even in global terms, it's a fairly large urban agglomeration. Johannesburg institutionally is governed by a single tier metropolitan authority, and that's important. And it's unusual internationally, as you would know. And it has its origins really in a post-apartheid attempt to redistribute territorially to redistribute public resources territorially from the wealthier, mainly white areas to the poorer, mainly black areas. And a single tier metropolitan authority enables this form of territorial redistribution. So it's also embedded within quite a complex political constitutional system of cooperative governance. So although we have a very powerful, large metropolitan authority, it must share power with a provincial government. Provincial government controls most of the health and education functions, for example, and environmental planning, and of course with national agencies. So Johannesburg is interesting institutionally. It had its origins in gold mining. It was a mining city, dominantly mining until about the 1940s. It then evolved as a manufacturing economy, and until the 1980s, when there was a level of deindustrialization. But already by the 1980s, the tertiary sectors were growing. And in the post-apartheid era, it's the tertiary sectors, especially business services, including finances, which have really driven the development of the city economy. But tertiary development of this order really creates a demand for high-skilled labor, whereas the majority of the labor force in Johannesburg is semi-skilled or low-skilled. And this has created a severe divide in the labor market and is a cause of very high levels of unemployment among the semi-skilled and low-skilled workers, and a shortage amongst skilled workers. So this is one of the other drivers, if you like, of inequality. The spatial form of Johannesburg was strongly shaped by its origins in mining, but it evolved as the economy has shifted. The spatial form is now much more complex, much more fluid as a post-industrial economy. And of course, it was significantly impacted on by apartheid, which was about it's about racially based spatial policy. Here's a map produced by our colleagues in the Gauteng City Region Observatory, the GCRO. It's a 3D representation of Gauteng province, or what we call the Gauteng City Region. It's illustrative of the considerable spatial complexity of the city region. Much of the territory really consists of really low density residential area. That's the green and the blue. And those were the previous white suburbs, and still very low density and sprawling. But there are pockets of medium density. In the southwest of Johannesburg, you'll see Soweto. It's still low rise, but quite small plots. And there are pockets of high density, informal settlements, for example. Alexandra Township, which is a very, very small area, closely packed together. And increasingly also the inner city of Johannesburg, which was a business precinct, but increasingly now is a gateway for migrants. So it's complex spatially. It's complex to move around this fragmented city region. Transportation is a huge challenge. And one of the reasons that most people rely on paratransit rather than fixed route public transport systems is because of the spatial complexity of the city. So if we look at, here's a 2D image from a book we've recently produced, an edited book called Densifying Johannesburg ? Johannesburg and Other Global Cases. But so key features of the spatial form really include the mining belt, which runs east-west and is still largely, although mining has ceased in Johannesburg, it's still largely empty land, dividing the city north-south. It's toxic land, it has to be rehabilitated. It adds to the complexity of spatial development. But you will also see the low-density, sprawling middle-class development to the north. You'll see Soweto as a pocket of medium density. That is what we call a township, a historical township, which was really a ghetto for the Black population in the past. And you'll see you will see some decentered nodes, places like Sandton, which is really where the formal property sector, real estate developers are concentrating their efforts. You'll see edge cities, such as Fourway, so that's familiar to an American audience. And you will also see within our spatial form some post-apartheid housing, public housing estates. And regretfully, many of them are as poorly located, if not worse located, than the apartheid era housing estates. And that's because of the way the system works. So it's the subsidies are paid to developers, and developers seek out the cheapest possible land, and the cheapest land is often on the urban edge. You also see in our spatial form informality. Unlike many other African cities, the majority of people don't live in informal settlements. About 1 in 5, 18% of the population are informally housed. But informality is certainly a key feature of our urban landscape. And gated estates. With high crime levels in Johannesburg, and that crime is a product of inequality, many people cluster in gated security estates. So there are spatial transitions. Here's a diagram from the book I spoke about. And post-apartheid, our city today is not the city that entered the post-apartheid era in 1994. It has grown significantly to start with. It's a much bigger city. It's a more complex city. If you look at the top left of that diagram, that's really the formal housing. You'll see the mining belt. You'll see that actually there is an urban edge around Johannesburg that has quite successfully held. And so to some extent, sprawl has been limited at the city level, not necessarily at the level of the city region, but within the city of Johannesburg by the imposition of an urban edge, which applies to Johannesburg, but not to the wider city region. And then you'll see the blue and the green, which are the new housing estates, making the point that many of those new public housing estates are quite peripheral. The next diagram is on informal housing, informal settlements. And you'll see we don't have informal settlements in the suburban middle-class suburbs. Middle-class residents have been quite successful in defending their territory and are quite organized in defending their territory. So informal settlements tend to cluster towards the edge of the city and on vacant land, particularly in the south of the city. Then the next diagram really is another form of informality. It's not the freestanding informal settlement. It's backyard accommodation. So many people living in traditional townships, segregated townships, which are formal and which are serviced, secure additional income by renting out accommodation in their backyards, often shacks. And the largest and the most rapid growth in informality is not the informal settlements, which are now quite static. It's backyard informal accommodation, and people have access to services in these backyards, and that's why people are moving into the backyards and not into informal settlements. So I have a figure somewhere. I think it's the growth over the past 15 years in backyard accommodation is 205%. Whereas for the city as a whole, it was a 60% growth. So a lot of the dynamic is actually hidden because you don't necessarily see it from the street. It's hidden in the backyards. So other trends which are important is medium density townhouses because of affordability, the emerging middle class, because of security concerns, people are moving into cluster housing. And then the final map there shows security villages. And those are gated estates, either new gated estates or retrofitted suburbs with fences built around them. And that again reflects concerns with security in the city of Johannesburg. So these are the trends. Overall, the spatial trends, we could argue, are driving towards greater inequality, although there is some blurring, the rise of the black middle class, for example. The dimensions of inequality are shifting. The evolving form represents both the spatial fluidity of the post-industrial city, but also the negative resilience of the past, of the apartheid past, of deeply entrenched patterns, which are difficult to change and may take decades to change. It reflects the locational decision-making of private developers. Alison will speak to that. It reflects the effects of post-apartheid policy, but often the unintended effects of post-apartheid policy. And so many of the changes have been a result of the loosening of controls rather than the proactive policies. And it reflects, of course, the everyday decision-making of residents in the city, and that's often a driver of informality. So here's a picture which is similar to the first, the picture from above I showed you at the beginning. This is Alexandra Township in the foreground. It's densely packed. It's got about 400,000 residents, very high unemployment, some middle-class housing in the foreground, but packed with shacks and with very high levels of poverty in Old Alexandra in the background. But there on the skyline, you will see it's often said to be the wealthiest square mile of real estate in the Southern Hemisphere. That's Sandton, that's a node in global networks. And again, just shows some of this extraordinary juxtapositioning of poverty and wealth in the city. In fact, Alexandra is relatively well located because the residents can walk to work in Sandton, those that can find work, which may be a minority of the population. Now, the question which we really address in the chapter is, to what extent can strategic spatial planning intervene meaningfully to improve the form of the city in a transformative direction? And in the post-apartheid era, strategic spatial planning has indeed been used by government across all spheres, but including metropolitan government, to attempt to transform the spatial dimensions of the city. Strategic spatial planning has been focused really on ideas in terms at the metropolitan scale. It's been focused on ideas of compaction, integration, transit-oriented development. There's been a particular focus on improving infrastructure, services, and the economy in the former Black townships, Black African townships, and in integrating the city using a transit-oriented development and knitting together the city. There was a long transitional period of negotiated development in the 1990s, but in the 2000s, the single-tier metropolitan authority was set up, and this really enabled this large-scale strategic spatial planning. So Johannesburg started off with something like 15 racially separated municipalities. It was then amalgamated into 5 transitional metropolitan municipalities in the 1990s, and then consolidated into a single municipality. And already by 2001, a metropolitan scale spatial development framework was developed, and this was elaborated through the years, and what you see on the screen is the most recent of the spatial development frameworks. And they're much more detailed frameworks for the districts or regions in the city, and for special nodal areas and corridors. So there really has been an attempt to transform the city spatially through planning. It's much more difficult to transform the economy of the city, to make the townships work economically as part of the mainstream city. It's easier to put in housing and infrastructure, as difficult as that still may be. A significant innovation in strategic spatial planning in Johannesburg was the attempt to align the capital budgets of the city with and infrastructure development in the city with the spatial plans. And so an important development happened in around 2006, when the city's spatial planning department was effectively given the instrument to direct the capital budget of the city. And so those are important moments of integration. It gave planning a sort of force that is often missing elsewhere. Instruments like the urban development boundary were put in place. A growth management strategy was put in place to try and align infrastructure to areas of growth, also to deal with infrastructure in the previously marginalized townships, and actually to be given the limited resources to spend on infrastructure, really to contain what is happening in areas of previous privilege and wealth, rather than to focus new investment and development there. So one can say that Johannesburg was an innovator nationally in terms of its spatial planning. The 2010 FIFA World Cup provided a real opportunity, because for the first time there were resources to invest in public infrastructure. The rapid rail system connecting to the airport and to Pretoria, the new bus rapid transit system, and this new infrastructure provided the backbone for transit-oriented development in the city, and what's really important in terms of the evolution of development. We mentioned informality, and in fact these spatial frameworks have struggled to deal with informality. They don't explicitly deal with informal settlements. It's much more effective in relation to the formal property sector. Although there was some experimentation in Johannesburg with the upgrading of informal settlements. So what we have seen following from the strategic spatial planning is some attempts at implementation. There is what we call the Corridors of Freedom initiative, which was launched by Mayor Parks Tau in, I think, 2013. And again, this was an attempt to build, to concentrate densification along transport corridors, to make the transport viable in the city, but also to use the opportunities of public transport to densify affordable housing, mainly lower middle class housing, working class housing along these corridors. And it was an important initiative. It was about increasing expenditure on social and physical infrastructure to support the densification. It was about fast tracking development processing in the city. It was about financial incentives to induce developers to move away from the north where they concentrated towards the sort of consolidated core of the city, linking also to Soweto. It was about the state purchasing land strategically for public-private partnerships with private sector developers along the corridor. It was about trying to enable higher density mixed uses, more affordable housing in strategically located areas. The consequences have been mixed. They've been very partial. There's been political change in the city. The initiative has lost momentum, but it's certainly not dead. It's still there, and you could still see some of the developments there. You can see some student housing that has come up recently along one of the corridors in that picture. There have been other initiatives to try and transform land use management to make the city more diverse in terms of its land uses. A nodal review, the most recent initiative, which tries to increase density in areas of maximum accessibility, inclusionary densification for both the residential and economic sectors. The inclusionary housing policies, for the first time in South Africa's history, we've managed to get an inclusionary housing policy passed in the city of Johannesburg, which requires developers, private developers, to ensure that at least 30% of the units they produced are affordable. They tend to be smaller units, and they might be downward rating, but it's a real attempt, and it's resisted to some degree, but a real attempt to bring inclusionary housing policies to the fore in the city of Joburg. They've been contested. The middle class has resisted. There've been political upsets, but certainly planning-led transformation has been one of the objectives of the city of Johannesburg. Patterns are deeply entrenched, and we need to ask real questions about why it has proved so difficult to use planning as an effective tool of transformation. I probably took more than my time, but Alison will talk to that question.
And that shows you one of the bus stops on the bus rapid transit system linked to the corridors of freedom. So just going on then to looking at some of the challenges and prospects, and to start off with looking at property markets and developers. So what we've seen is that private property developments have largely been contrary to the plan intentions. To a large extent, the private property sector is very concentrated. It's been very focused on upmarket and middle class development, and a lot of that has been on the edge of the city. It hasn't, as Phil said, it hasn't really gone beyond the urban edge, or not to any great extent. But a lot of these major developments, the gated estates, have tended to be on the edge of the city, where large land parcels have been available, where land is cheaper. And then we've also seen low middle income housing developments on the edges of the former black townships, but again, also on the edges. We have also seen some private townhouse developments, again aimed at the middle and upper income groups. across the city, but to a large extent, they've missed the poor, and they've really focused on this kind of edge developments. There's a level of responsiveness to the Gautrain, that's the rapid rail system that Phil mentioned, that goes between the airport, Joburg, and Pretoria in the adjacent municipality. So we've seen a lot of concentration, particularly in Sandton and Rosebank, which are major economic nodes. But again, that's very oriented to office and commercial developments aimed at and focused on upper income markets and upper income upper sectors and so on. We've also seen the private property industry now moving into the former townships, mostly focused on shopping centres, and that to some extent reflects the fact that you actually have most of the population in those areas, huge, underexploited from their perspective consumer markets, and also the fact that shopping centres in the upmarket areas have been exhausted, they've been overinvested in, and so on. So you've seen this big movement into those areas as well. Then the last area where we are seeing some level of consistency with the plan is around affordable rental housing. Affordable ownership housing has tended to be concentrated on the periphery, on the other side on the edges of the former townships and in parts of those former townships. But the affordable rental is starting to happen in the inner city and also on the corridors of freedom. And a lot of that is smaller developers who have discovered a new market. They've found a model for doing affordable rental housing. So they've taken up those kinds of opportunities. And this is one of the interesting areas where we're seeing some consistency with the plans. We've seen the planners working with those kinds of developers. Student housing is another part of that market. And slowly we're seeing bigger real estate investment trusts moving into both the affordable and student housing markets. And I think that to some extent mirrors what's happening internationally as well. But they're very interesting models in the South African context where they're really building on local initiative and local patterns as well. The townships, the former black townships there where black people were forced to stay under apartheid, and the new housing areas have been a big focus of state initiatives of spatial transformation. There's a recognition that actually most people live in those places. There's a need to take them seriously, to develop in those areas. And so we've had big investment in infrastructure, in services, in social infrastructure, and quite significant initiatives to try to promote economic development in those areas, to focus on tourism, to focus to some extent on industry and on shopping centres. When the shopping centre, part of it is very controversial. There's an argument that it's squeezing out low income and local small entrepreneurs. So there are a whole lot of limits to it. And what we've seen also is that really the kind of private property industry that's gone into townships is absolutely dwarfed by what's gone elsewhere. So it's a very small part of the big picture, but there are other initiatives in those township areas as well, and perhaps those are much more important than these big developers going into those areas. Another big issue has been the question of access to well-located housing close to major economic nodes and other sorts of jobs accommodating the poor. So to a large extent, you know, the planning has wanted to encourage well-located housing accommodating the poor, but it's not been very successful in doing that. probably the closest it's got to that is this kind of affordable rental housing that's come into the inner city and onto the corridors. There's also quite a lot of informal housing that's happened in those areas as well. And that's really how the poor have come into those areas. The new formal rental models are not really accessing the very poor. They're really targeting the upper end of the affordable housing market. So they're not reaching the very poor, who actually account for something like half of the city. So there's the sort of people who earn under 3,500 who are going into these low-income housing schemes on the edge, are not really getting into this affordable rental. Even inclusionary housing that the city has promoted doesn't get to that level of income, though they'd like to go there. It's really the people who have regular jobs and housing, or not housing, but have regular jobs, who can access that kind of housing. So it's still a big gap. I mean, the inclusionary housing has been a really important initiative, but it unfortunately doesn't reach far enough down the income ladder. Another big area that we looked at, and that is a question of the effectiveness of planning, is the whole issue of governance. I think Phil talked quite a lot about how the consolidation of the city into one municipality really helped to strengthen planning. It meant that you could redistribute across areas. We also had a long period of very supportive mayors, Mayor Masondo, Mayor Parks Tau, until about 2016. And since then, we've had a political shift to the Democratic Alliance from 2016 till really earlier this year, I think, where they were in control of government. They weren't particularly supportive of all the directions that the old African National Congress-led government took. They were in alliance with the economic freedom fighters, which were on the, so it was a kind of a left-right coalition. But in the process, neither of them were particularly focused on planning. They were concerned about trying to improve conditions in informal settlements and in townships, but and in the inner city as well, but not so much on these grand schemes to restructure the city, to transform spatially. So that has been one of the difficult issues. Since we wrote the chapter, the African National Congress has come back into power. The Democratic Alliance mayor left the Democratic Alliance. That whole coalition fell apart. But I don't know that the new ANC government is quite as focused on some of these older visions than the earlier mayors. We've also seen quite different interests across government. I think Phil talked about these big housing projects on the periphery, and that's really the evidence of the drive for housing delivery that came from national government and from provincial government, with obviously local government supporting the idea of low-income housing, but not being so keen on it being in those areas. So that kind of, there've been quite a lot of policy contradictions. There've also been divergent provincial visions more recently, since about 2015, in the last couple of years. National and provincial governments have started talking about new cities, about big housing projects, and to a degree there is a disillusionment with this idea of compaction and integration. There's this idea that perhaps we shouldn't try to restructure the city away from apartheid. Maybe we should be creating completely new cities that embody these more integrated visions. So in a sense, that's gained strength. And this map that you see here shows some of these proposed new city developments. They're also big, very big housing, low-income housing developments. They're not meant to be just low-income housing. They're meant to be much more mixed, embodying a range of housing types. And a lot of those, by virtue of the size of land that is needed, would be on the edge of the city. The latest one that is under discussion and is actually being mounted at the moment is Lanseria development, which you can faintly see right on the northwest. This idea of a major new development around a small airport. So, and that contradicts the cities, the municipalities' idea about compaction and integration. In this period, since about 2009 as well, we had a number of years under President Zuma, and which was seen as a fairly corrupt regime that undermined capacity at national level, and we've now gone back to a different presidency under President Ramaphosa since for the last 2 years or so, and in that process, we've seen shifting approaches, shifting visions. Overall, I think in government, there's been declining capacity, declining coherence. I think the presidency under Ramaphosa is really trying to correct the corruption, trying to do something about capacity, but it's quite a legacy to deal with. In addition to all of that, collaborative governance at the level of the Gauteng city region has tended to be lacking. We do have a provincial government that's quite a strong provincial government. We do have a provincial spatial framework, but many other elements like cross-cooperation between municipalities has tended to be lacking. Then the final challenge that has been dealt with is around political issues, political contestation. It's a very unequal society. The social compact is quite fragile. There's some levels of contestation around land. Middle classes, as Phil mentioned, resisting encroachment of anything that might reduce property values in their area. There's a challenge to land. There's an argument that we should be doing land expropriation. We're now taking up the idea of urban land reform that is being explored. We see land invasions, but very often on the edges of the city rather than on the periphery, rather than in more central areas. The African National Congress has declined in its political position, but perhaps is regaining that now, as I mentioned. And we've had political shifts that affected the spatial plan. So as I said, the Democratic Alliance, in alliance with the economic freedom fighters, have not been that keen on spatial planning. So some of the links between spatial planning and infrastructure were weakened. A coalition politics has landed up sometimes with quite strange outcomes. The inclusionary housing policy was supported, but initially the nodal density review was not, though that has now gone through. So it's a bit of a fragmented politics, and it's shifting again now with the ANC coming back into power. So in conclusion, I think we've seen both the potentials and also the limits of spatial planning in a context of incredibly high structural inequalities. It's very difficult to expect planning to really do something about inequalities that are quite deeply rooted in economic inequalities, in social and other inequalities as well. We have nevertheless seen progressive policies in Joburg, probably more progressive than in many other parts of the country. The outcomes of policies, I think, have been disappointing, but there is more change than is sometimes acknowledged. However, the formal planning initiatives perhaps have done less than simply informalization through a loosening of controls. We would argue that planning could have done more, but though it's been quite constrained, but there is quite a lot of potential to do more. Urban land reform is an interesting area that will be significant in future, perhaps with the possibility of exploring access to affordable housing to a much greater extent. And there's a lot of potential also to work with the informal trends, the processes of densification that Phil talked about. To a large extent, the formal policies haven't really worked with that, and they could do so much more. So, for example, the corridors policies very much focused on property developers, what they could do, but didn't really work with the informal housing that is already there, the informal processes that are already there, the informal processes in the inner city, the backyard housing, which is a very key part of the densification, as Phil mentioned. And so there's a lot more that could be done in future. Thanks, I'll leave it at that. And I would just like to go on to, to show our sources, this very nice picture of looking from a window somewhere in the inner city onto the dense part of the part of the city that is built in terms of its built form and in terms of population, and to show all our sources of images for each slide. And maybe we should just leave them up so whoever watches it can actually read it. Thanks.
Fantastic, wonderful. Thank you very much, Philip, Alison. When I followed your presentations, is remarkable. I mean, reading your chapters is different when following your presentation through video here. Okay, Philip and Alison, now Q&A. The first question is about the context of your chapter, because in UNDESA report, the number is quite different. In 1960, 1.1, 1980, 1.5 million, 2000, 3.0, 2018, 5.4 million. But UNDESA predict or project a population of Johannesburg in 2030 become 11.5 million. So I guess this number is representing Gauteng region. So maybe you can provide us with a context of this number.
Okay, I think one just has to be very careful with population figures for Johannesburg, and I'm sure that's true of most cities, because they sometimes refer to different jurisdictions and those definitions also change over time. So as you said, currently city of Joburg would be a bit over 5 million. In the apartheid era, the city of Joburg was much smaller than it is now in terms of definition. And it also didn't include several areas that are part of it now, such as Sandton, but also a lot of the black townships like Soweto and Alexandra. And then some international figures for Johannesburg are talking about the Witwatersrand, which is 8 or 9 million. So if you look at Shlomo Angel's study of densities in world cities, he talks about Johannesburg as a continuous built-up area of about 8 million. So that's way beyond the municipality. Then there's also the city region that's about 14 or 15 million, and some of which even goes beyond the province. So I think that there's likely to have been some sort of slippage in the UNDESA report. I very much doubt that we'll get to 11 million by 2030. I mean, the growth rate just isn't that fast.
All right. Thank you for the clarification that way. Now, the purpose of this video also to provide that information in more detail. Okay, so my next question is how does planning occur in that Gauteng city region? And how does it relate to planning in Johannesburg? Philip?
Yeah, thanks very much. The answer is not simple because our national constitution adopted in 1996, which allocates powers and functions across the spheres of government, is really quite complicated. So there are three ostensibly autonomous spheres of government: national, provincial, and local. And they must work with each other cooperatively. They must resolve disputes through dialogue, engagement, negotiation. In terms of the constitution, there isn't a hierarchy. There aren't levels of government, although some degree of hierarchy works in practice. At times, this cooperation works. At times, relationships are tense and outcomes can be contradictory, even incoherent, even when all three spheres are governed by the same political party. So all three spheres of government have got planning powers, and they plan simultaneously without a formal hierarchy, trying to build synergy as they go along. So the relationships sometimes are difficult, especially between provincial government, Gauteng provincial government, and the metropolitan authorities in Gauteng, because they all have more or less the same institutional power. So provincial government has a spatial development framework, metropolitan governments have spatial development frameworks, and sometimes they don't match up. And this is often because they have different spatial visions. So provincial government, for example, has been trying to develop new cities beyond the urban boundary, whereas Johannesburg's metropolitan government has been trying to consolidate, compact, densify within the urban core. And this leads to disjunctures. Sometimes they're resolved, sometimes not. In fact, one of the disputes between provincial government and city government went to the highest court in the land, the Constitutional Court. That's unusual, but it did happen. And there's also the challenge of horizontal coordination. And so planning across provincial boundaries, planning across municipal boundaries is often not well coordinated. National government is now talking about developing a one plan for all spheres of government that would be negotiated across the spheres. This is still in a policy making stage, and we don't know if it's going to work out. But we do need to do something to ensure greater coherence across the spheres of government.
Thank you. My next question is, your presentation started with that powerful image by Times Magazine about inequality. So my next question about that topic. So racial inequality in space was a key part of apartheid. So what has happened post-apartheid? Has there been a movement toward greater integration? In what ways and what roles has planning played in these processes?
Okay, so obviously racially based legal barriers to where people live no longer exist, and the city is changing. Planning hasn't considered race directly. I think the hope has been that its general policies on spatial transformation would indirectly address this. And policies, for example, such as inclusionary housing and others to promote the development of more affordable housing in well-located areas is intended to address racial desegregation, though it's unlikely to reach the very poor who are almost entirely Black. Residential areas are no longer obviously designated by race. Income is much more of a factor in where people live. But since poor people are overwhelmingly Black, de facto segregation does continue. Many Black people who can afford to do so have moved to new racially mixed or former white areas, but some choose to stay where they are. or where they were, either because it's cheaper or they prefer to do so for social and other reasons. Some inner city areas that were once white tend to be almost entirely black now, but the former black township areas are largely black. There's a lot more mixing in workplaces, shopping areas, schools, and other places like that. So in a way, one might hope for greater integration going forward. But it's complicated. Taking the example of schools, there's mixing in private schools and in public schools in former white areas. Some schools in former white areas also accommodate the children of people who work in those suburbs, like domestic workers. But some studies have shown that these are not necessarily such simple issues. For instance, children of people living in informal settlements close to these areas have had difficulty accessing some of those schools, perhaps because of incomes, because those schools require additional payment as well, which is not required in township schools, and for other reasons as well. Some school children are commuting very long distances to reaching schools, often at quite considerable class cost, so there's quite a pressure with this. And then there's the more difficult and complex social issues, the question about how much social mixing actually occurs or doesn't occur and how that occurs. And there are questions around the values and practices of some of these schools in former white areas, with many critics and many students also arguing that it tends to privilege whiteness. And there have been some big debates about some of those issues and some very interesting and useful research as well. So in a sense, the distance is not as great, but there are very big issues still to be addressed there.
All right, as you know that here in the US, since the killing of George Floyd is like wake up call for us to pay more attention to this racial inequality. So what do you see? Lessons from Johannesburg that you can think applicable to other parts of the world?
Let me just say very briefly that, I mean, while Joburg has its own particularities and its own sort of idiosyncratic history, especially apartheid, it clearly can be brought into a conversation with cities across the globe, because whether you're in the north or the south, cities are facing challenges of inequality, of social spatial divide, of informality, even in the north, challenges of mobility and so on. So these big topics, despite how particular the contexts are common topics, we're still grappling with them, and then no easy solutions. So we can't say that we have the magic bullet which we can transfer from Johannesburg to elsewhere, or in fact from elsewhere to Johannesburg. But certainly what we found in our own work is that comparison and conversation helps us sharpen the understanding of our own context. Looking at Johannesburg through other contexts, or looking at other contexts through Johannesburg, can sharpen the understanding of what we're looking at and can inspire, often inspire some innovation. And for instance, we've looked at Johannesburg's Corridors of Freedom initiative, a far from perfect initiative, but it's a form of TOD that begins with the question of integrating the city. It's not a form of TOD that has the sort of mixed objectives of TOD you find in many other contexts. So looking at Johannesburg's experience of the Corridors of Freedom, I think would be very helpful in many other contexts. I'm looking, for example, at the way Johannesburg has undertaken its spatial development framework and elaborated the spatial development framework over the past decade, looking at initiatives around backyarding as a source of new accommodation, rental accommodation initiatives, and more. So just as other cities can talk to Johannesburg, I think there are many elements in the Johannesburg experience that can speak more widely.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is my last questions. So how does Johannesburg strategic spatial planning address gender and informality?
Okay, so the plan doesn't address gender or informality directly. Informality is considered in other policy documents like the long-term city development strategies. It's considered in the analysis for plans and in specific policies. For instance, there is a policy to regularize informal settlements. It's considered in inner city planning. But there is an ambivalence towards informality on the part of officials and politicians, and policies and practices shift and they can be quite inconsistent. So on the one hand, there's a recognition that informality and, for instance, informal economies are here to stay, that they're important in contributing to livelihoods in a context where unemployment is extremely high. It was, for instance, around 30% even before COVID. So there's that sort of recognition. On the other hand, many politicians and also officials struggle to embrace it with, for instance, a crackdown on informal trading in the inner city only a couple of years ago. Informal backyarding, as Philip said, is a very significant growth areas, but we don't really have policies that are recognizing it, is supporting it in a positive and constructive way. So in planning, there's an ongoing struggle about these issues. If we look at gender, again, the strategic spatial plan doesn't address gender. It wasn't considered in the analysis underpinning the plan, or really in other policy documents influencing the plan. You know, one could argue that several of Johannesburg's policy emphases are consistent with an approach that considers gender, such as, you know, the emphasis on improving basic services and infrastructure, the emphasis on spatial transformation, accessibility, and improving access to well-located housing. But what has been missing is any sort of process that looks at the diversity of women and men's experiences in the cities, their different needs and interests, to test whether current approaches are appropriate and sufficient. You know, for instance, there's some good research on gender in the city that could be built on, including work indicating the difficulty that mothers face in negotiating the city. Big questions like violence against women and safety aren't really considered, although some of that might be planning considered in planning at a more local level. But a lot more could really be done in this sphere.
Thank you so much, Alison and Phillips. So that's to conclude the Q&A. So I like to finish up this video with concluding remark from each of you. So I invite each of you to provide a couple minutes concluding remark in reference to the chapters that you brought and also our video presentations.
Thank you very much, and thanks for this wonderful opportunity to participate. I will just be very brief. I just want to go back to our starting point and our starting slide and the idea of inequality. And you know, planning discourse is dominated, for example, by ideas of sustainability, which are really important. But for a city like Johannesburg, with such deep inequality and social spatial divide, sustainability is impossible unless those are resolved. And so sustainability and inequality must go hand in hand. The challenge for those of us working in the planning tradition is really how to tackle inequality, and that's what our chapter really tries to grapple with. And we recognize the limitations of planning, and we need to understand the limitations of planning. We can't really deal through planning and spatial rearrangement with those deep structural issues, but we can do something. we can do something to mitigate the impacts of inequality and to reduce some dimensions of inequality. And we need to focus our attention on where and how. And that's what we've tried to do in the chapter. It's not easy. The Johannesburg experience has really been very mixed. But for us, it's an important starting point.
Thank you, Phillips. Alison?
Yes, just to add, I think strategic spatial planning in Johannesburg has come a long way, but it could go further in addressing some of the issues we mentioned. I think it could also think more deeply and more contextually about the processes of spatial change underway and how they could be better managed and supported. And that requires stronger engagement with and consideration of processes happening on the ground, including informal processes like backyarding and informal densification. So while the city is talking about promoting urban compaction, and that's useful, it needs to consider that more contextually, looking at how densification processes are occurring and how they can be addressed, rather than just focusing on more formal state and developer-led processes, which largely aren't reaching the urban poor. And I think more generally, strategic spatial planning needs to surface and address these processes more specifically. Thanks. And thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Phillips. Alison, it's my pleasure to host both of you here in video presentation, and also, of course, for your chapters in the book. Thank you so much.